Hi, folks, and welcome to another episode of Israel Explained. Today, we're going to be talking about what is going on with the hostage exchange deals. Just yesterday, it looked like there wasn't much of a gap, or I should say, there was a more manageable gap between Israel and Hamas over the next hostage deal. And today, we're hearing completely different stories. We're hearing that talks have been broken off and that they will remain broken for the near future. So a lot of people are writing off the talks right now, but I don't think that there's any reason to do that. So let's recap where we were yesterday. Just yesterday, there was representatives from Hamas, Ismail Ania, who's the highest commander in all of Hamas on the political side, representatives of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they were meeting with Egyptian intelligence in Cairo. And the leaks that had come from there were that Hamas was demanding a 2 week ceasefire, while Israel wanted 1 week ceasefire. Hamas demanded the release of some of the heaviest prisoners that Israel has, and Israel had actually agreed to that, including Marwan Barghouti, who may end up being the Palestinian Authority president if he's released and is considered to be the heaviest card that Israel has in its prisoner um, arsenal. But now, Yahya Sinwar, who commands the Hamas terrorist organization in Gaza, has come out and said that there will be no ceasefire. Sorry, there will be no hostage deal until there's a complete cessation of the military operation. That, of course, is something that Israel cannot accept. And that adds to other things Israel's having a problem accepting, like a strategic withdrawal from several key areas in the Gaza Strip, something else Israel doesn't want to do. The way Israel envisions this, it's willing to go to a ceasefire for a week. My guess is they'd be willing to expand it to 2 weeks too, under duress. It's willing to release whatever prisoners it needs to in order to get this done. But there's two things that Israel requires. It wants to remain everywhere that it is now so that it can continue to expand its hold in Gaza. And it wants to go back to the operation, hopefully on full throttle, as soon as the ceasefire ends. So right now, there's no compatibility there on those issues. Hania seems to be willing to allow that to happen. But Sinwar is not. And that's not too surprising because Sinwar is the one who would actually be dealing with the IDF on his doorstep if the operation continues. So it makes sense that Sinwar is more committed to completely stopping this operation than Ismail Hania would be. That's at least a narrative that we're hearing on the news. I'm not so certain that that's completely true. I'm not so certain that this is a power play between Hania and Sinwar completely. I'm not convinced this is the only aspect to this situation. According to some reports I saw today on Israeli Channel 12, Sinwar released a statement saying that it has to be a full cessation of hostilities while Hania was negotiating, and that humiliated Hania and undercut his position. And that may be true, but it also may be true that Hamas is using the split between Hania and Sinwar in order to improve its bargaining position. Because Israel, by agreeing to release the heaviest prisoners and possibly leaning towards agreeing to 2 weeks instead of one, is showing that it's willing to um, go past a lot of its red lines in order to pursue another hostage deal. So I think a lot of people in Hamas are smelling weakness after the death of 9 soldiers in Sajawiyah and then Israel's mistaken killing of 3 hostages in Sajawiyah. So I think there's a lot of that. Right now, talks haven't actually ended. The face-to-face talks that were very promising seem to have ended. The Egyptians and Qataris are now, according to some reports, trying to convince Sinwar to take a 2 week pause and exchange dead bodies. But I don't think Sinwar wants that particularly, and for Israel, that is a complete non-starter. So that's not particularly serious. So once this crisis started, Earlier today, an Israeli senior official briefed the press, and he said that talks have stopped, which, as I said, that's not completely true. And he stressed another point of contention, not the ceasefire and cessation of the operation, but rather he said that what's imperative for Israel is that the 17 women and children on the list from the previous exchange that had not been given to Israel be released first. So he said Israeli condition is that. And I think that's very telling. That may suggest that Israel is willing to make more concessions in exchange for those 17 women and children. I think that if Hamas can find them, they have a very important card on the table that may help them to achieve other things. So after that briefing, which people reacted to as the end of all talks, an Israeli source, senior Israeli source, toward Channel 12, quote, "It's very early to write off talks. We knew this would be difficult and complicated. We are determined to look under every rock and succeed despite all obstacles," end quote. Meanwhile, a Qatari source told the London Saudi-funded newspaper Asharq al-Awsat that Hamas may be willing to waive its demand to end the operation if Israel significantly lowers the intensity of what it's doing. So I think all this really shows that talks are not dead, they're stalled, and both sides are looking to maneuver and improve their bargaining position. So Israel right now is doing two things in order to improve its bargaining position. Three things. First, it's saying that right now there are no talks and there will be no agreement to show that we're not that interested in a deal. That's sort of a attempt to play hard to get. That's not going to be very convincing to Hamas. Another thing they're doing, they're talking to the Americans. They want two things from the Biden administration right now. One is for them to show that there's no deadline for Israel. There's all this talk about a deadline for Israel 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. Israel really would like the Americans to now say, there's no deadline, do what you want, so that Sinwar doesn't feel like he can run out the clock and would want a ceasefire more. Another thing Israel is expecting the Biden administration to do, which is more likely, is to pressure Qatar so that Qatar can pressure Hamas into pursuing a hostage agreement. That's important. But even more important is the expansion of the Israeli military operation. Today, we saw a major escalation, not only in blowing up the main compound that Sinwar and others worked out of, but more importantly, they entered Nusirat and Al Daraj. Nusirat is a refugee camp between Gaza City and Khan Yunis. Al Daraj is one of the few remaining unoccupied neighborhoods in Gaza. It's part of the old city in Gaza, not considered to be as tough as Sajawiyah and um, other places that Israel has lost soldiers, a lot of soldiers in, but also a place that needs to be purified. And Israel's also working to isolate Khan Yunis so that no reinforcements can come in. That isolation includes taking all the land around it and trying to blow up all tunnels leading into it and out of it, all to make Sinwar and the leadership feel more trapped. Because according to intelligence, he's still in Khan Yunis and plans to make a stand there. So remember, all this is bargaining. The war is the continuation of bargaining by other means, and the bargaining is the continuation of war by other means. The two are intermingled, linked, and are, in a very real sense, the same thing. The way that Hamas got leverage over Israel was by killing Israeli soldiers and by that accident where Israel killed its own hostages. The way Israel got leverage over Hamas in the first deal was through the rapid expansion of its military operations. So a lot of the future of this deal is dependent on what happens on the battlefield. And remember, uh, two sides do want to reach an agreement. Israel obviously has very important interests here. Releasing the hostages is one of the most politically and morally important elements for Israel in the entire campaign. We all know that. But It's not like Hamas doesn't want a deal. Ismail Haniyeh did not travel to Egypt and put himself at risk in, in order to further a deal that he's not interested in. He's interested in a deal, and he calls the shots technically more than Sinwar, and that means that there's a strong interest on Hamas's part to complete this deal. So whatever people say that the talks are off, that's a bargaining tactic. It shows the two sides aren't ready to reach an agreement yet. It doesn't show that they aren't willing to reach an agreement yet. And what happens on the battlefield will determine the terms of it. And of course, we'll be following all that very closely right here. So let's move on to our viewers' questions, which are great as always. So, close friend of the show, close personal friend of mine, Bimaya says, can you explain more fully the status of Gaza? I keep hearing Gaza was completely vacated by Israel in 2005, and Gaza had their own elections and chose Hamas to lead them. How is that different from being a state? And since Gaza is under Hamas leadership and the Hamas charter's stated goal is to destroy Israel completely, what would look differently in a two-state solution? Okay, a lot to unpack there. And other people have told me that I need to elucidate these concepts in history a little bit more fully and not take for granted that the audience knows all this stuff. So this really helps me do that. Okay, so the status of Gaza. Gaza was part of the British Mandate up until 1948. Then in the 1948 war, it was taken by Egypt. Egypt never claimed it for themselves. Israel conquered it in 1967, handed it over to the PLO as part of the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. In 2005, for various reasons, the Israeli government unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, leaving Gaza in the hands of the Palestinian Authority. The following year, there were the first and so far only Palestinian Authority elections, which Hamas won, much to the surprise and chagrin of Israel and the United States. The Palestinian Authority did not recognize that Hamas had beaten Fatah in the elections and held on to government. Hamas didn't like that and engineered a coup in Gaza, successfully taking over Gaza, killing a lot of Palestinian Authority officials, um, and turning it into a Gaza fiefdom. And now we see the result of all these years of rule by Hamas, of 15 years of rule by Hamas. Why is this not a state? Um, States are based on several things. They're based on territory, population, control, basically whether you act like a state. Gaza does act like a state. In fact, it probably acts like a state more than the Palestinian Authority does because the Palestinian Authority is dependent on Israel for security, and Hamas until now was not. But states also involve recognition from the entire international community, and that all of the Palestinian Authority doesn't have, although it has it partially, and Hamas doesn't have it all. No one recognizes Hamas in Gaza as an independent, separate state. Not even its own allies, Iran and Qatar, do. They recognize a Palestinian state, which Gaza is part of. So recognition is an important part of that. And then you asked, how would that look differently in a two-state solution than it does now, since Hamas vow to destroy Israel? And the answer to that is a two-state solution would involve a treaty between Israel and the Palestinian state. That treaty would call for peace and mutual recognition. So it would not be governed, at least officially, by the principles of mutual destruction. And Israel will not allow Hamas to be part of that two-state solution, and Hamas wouldn't be willing necessarily to be part of it, even if Israel would, because, like you said, they vow to destroy Israel. I hope that answers the question because there was a lot to unpack there. Another close personal friend of mine, Syra, asks, does Israel oppose the U.S. plan to empower Palestinian Authority in Gaza after the war? What post-war roadmap does Israel propose? Well, that's a great question. Does Israel oppose the PA plan of the United States? The answer to that is yes and no. Netanyahu has been very vocal on saying that he doesn't want the PA to return to Gaza. So technically, the answer is no. But he has shown willingness to let the Palestinian Authority back in through the back door, to allow its officials to rule there, to allow its rules back in, um, without actually calling it the Palestinian Authority. So there's some scope there. Israel has played games like this before, like under Shamir in the Madrid conference. It wasn't willing to talk to the PLO. So it wasn't talking to representatives in the Madrid conference who were technically part of the PLO, but it talked to people who were authorized by the PLO to talk on their behalf. So there's a lot of stupid games that can be played in this regard, and I have a feeling we're going to see every single one of those stupid games play out, or at least be talked about. And what does Israel propose? Israel proposes the most important thing from Israel's perspective is that Gaza be demilitarized. And demilitarized doesn't mean there's no Israeli military because there'll be a hell of a lot of it. It means that Gazans won't have arms, Gazans won't have an army, won't have terrorist organizations, won't have any of that. That's the most important thing that Israel wants. And it views the control there, which will have a heavy influence, at least, possibly direct control from Arab states, and will be run by Palestinian technocrats, as in bureaucrats doing their job without wider political ambitions. At first, that would be under heavy Israeli control, and then that would move to perhaps some kind of international control slowly, while Israel would still have the ability to operate in the Gaza Strip. So that's what I'm hearing from Israelis that they want. It's pretty vague. Other Israeli politicians who are not Netanyahu, like Gantz and Lapid, would probably be more amenable to a fully fledged two-state solution. And that matters because Netanyahu may not be in power for long after the war, although, as we've discovered, writing Netanyahu off is a fool's errand in Israeli politics. Ian asks, another great friend of the show from Australia. I don't know if you have discussed this previously, but has the current progress of the war been the best option, considering the extent of casualties? Or could a protracted counterinsurgency, as suggested by Ezra Klein et al., may have been a better option from the standpoint of global support? So it really depends on what you mean by a better option. For global support, Israel could have not done anything at all and just tried to take the sympathy that it had after October 7th and take it to the bank. But that's not what Israel believes is in its best interest. What it believes is in its best interest is destroying Hamas's control in Gaza completely. Um, what Israel is doing right now in Gaza is a protracted counterinsurgency. Um, what some people are calling for is a more pinpointed use of special forces, and that wouldn't even begin to neuter the capabilities of Hamas. We're seeing that even this absolute juggernaut of an invasion using 4 or 5 Israeli divisions, depending on which reports you believe, with massive bombardment, evacuation of civilians, hasn't brought Hamas to its knees. I don't see how more minor operations could even begin to do that. At best, it could maybe disrupt Hamas, etc., but then Hamas would be standing after its massive success on October 7th, still controlling the Gaza Strip, still standing against Israel. That would be, Israel believes, and I believe, such a blow to Israeli deterrence that it would jeopardize its ability to survive in the long term. So I don't think there's a better option. Yeah, the less Israel did, the more global support it would get. But most Israelis believe that destroying Hamas is worth a significant hit in global support. And one of the reasons for that ties into a previous question, right? I was asked about the evacuation of Gaza in 2005. When Israel left Gaza in 2005, Israelis were told there would be all this outpouring of sympathy for its position because it ended the occupation in Gaza. And we know that what happened is Israel was accused for years of apartheid, open air prisoner, genocide, all these buzzwords that arose to describe the fact that Israel had actually left the Gaza Strip. So Israelis are kind of tired of that. If we do A, B, and C, the world will love us, and tend to rely a lot more on um, the force of its military to make the situation better. And Israeli history has shown that that tends to work better as well. Finally, another friend of the show. Everyone who's asking questions is very close to the show. Fred. says, since it's in Israel's best interests to get as many civilians out of Gaza, how about relocating them temporarily to displacement camps located in the Negev? This will allow Israel to control the situation, including the flow of aid. Also, it takes the situation out of the hands of the Egyptians, who spent a great deal of the last dozen years looking the other way while Hamas smuggled weapons into Gaza. Clearly, Egypt has its own agenda here, which doesn't necessarily align with the interests of the Israelis or Palestinians. Do you think this idea might be workable? Well, it depends on what you mean by workable. Um, the answer, I guess, is no. First of all, I don't know how many people in Gaza would actually want to go to Israel. Second, I know for a fact Israelis don't want Palestinians on their territory, rightly or wrongly. That's the last thing that Israel could swing now. It would have some security problems too, which probably would be surmountable, but would be very, very difficult to do. And Israel would face all sorts of accusations that it was doing ethnic cleansing and the like, which would be um, difficult for Israel to disprove, since it's encouraging taking people out of Gaza and moving them elsewhere. As for the Egyptian interests not aligning with Israel, their interests definitely don't align with Israel on this matter. Israel really wants Palestinian refugees to go into Egypt and be Egypt's problem. That is not in Egypt's interests. I totally understand why they don't want that. And considering the troubles they've had with terrorism in Sinai, that would be a nightmare from their perspective. Although Israel would have the same problems in the Negev. But I wouldn't take that point too far and say that Israeli and Egyptian interests don't align. They're not identical, but Israeli and Egyptian interests about weakening Hamas are strong, and they've united Israel and Egypt in purpose for a very long time. And Israel considers the Al Sisi administration to be a reliable and close ally. Not always 100% capable, not free of corruption, not free of different interests, but one of the best partners Israel has in working in the region. Okay, so that is the end of our episode for today. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me and this YouTube on Patreon and Shael Media on that website. Check out History of the Land of Israel podcast as well. And I will see you here tomorrow